So, continuing from 7A, does the actual working of Indian federalism conform to the centralizing tendency in the Indian polity? Give reasons for your answer. तो यहाँ पे हम देख सकते हैं कि actual working of Indian federal centralizing tendency in Indian polity, यानी कि centralizing जो tendency है उससे टकराव हो रहा है कि नहीं, ठीक है, इंडियन फेडरलिज्म का कैसे हो रहा है, गिव रीजन फॉर योर आंसर। तो देखते हैं, द टर्म फेडरलिज्म कम्स फ्रॉम लैटिन वर्ड, क्या होता है आपका, फीडस से आता है, फीडस मीनिंग कॉन्ट्रैक्ट, कॉन्ट्रैक्ट इन विच द गवर्नमेंट इज एस्टैब्लिश्ड बाय अ कॉन्ट्रैक्ट अकॉर्डिंग टू, कौन है, लुइस टेलिन। इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन एग्जांपल ऑफ ग्रेट क्रिएटिविटी, क्या है, ग्रेट क्रिएटिविटी। Indian federalism is a blend of federal features with unitary bias, dual polity, written and rigid constitution, supremacy of constitution, division of power। तो ये सारा हम लोगों ने फीचर्स लिख दिया ऑफ इंडियन फेडरलिज्म। अब तीसरा पैराग्राफ है, प्रोफेसर केसी वेयर, केसी वेयर compared Indian model with the US model, he declared India to be quasi federal, ये बोला जाता है, एक पॉलिटी में आता है। Now, according to him, India is a federal in form but unitary in spirit. He calls it quasi-federal because of various centralizing provisions like emergency powers with center, all India services, integrated judiciary, legislative power with the center, etc. अब आपका सर आइवर जेनी feels that India is federation with a strong centralizing tendency. Thus, numerous scholars reflecting on the vast powers left with the government of India and subordinate role of states and also the crucial power of the union to practically annihilate an existing state doubt whether India is a federation at all. Some have called it a pseudo federation. तो बहुत लोगों ने बोला झूठ मूठ का फेडरेशन है, it's a totally central tendency, exhibiting central tendencies. Now, however, according to Granville Austin, इंडियन फेडरेशन इज द प्रोडक्ट ऑफ यूनिक सर्कमस्टांसेस। तो ग्रैनविल ऑस्टिन ने सबसे बढ़िया बात बोला है कि वी आर कैटरिंग टू आवर डिमांड्स एंड इट्स अ प्रोडक्ट ऑफ यूनिक सर्कमस्टांसेस विच इंडिया हैज फेस्ड, विच एवर कंट्री विल फेस अ सक्सेशनिस्ट ट्रेंड, मतलब कि जो बोलते हैं कि मेरे कंट्री से छोड़ के निकल जाएंगे उसे बोलते हैं सेसेशनिस्ट ट्रेंड, is bound to have a model, तो उनको उस तरह का मॉडल यूज पड़ता है where the center is strong, and Granville Austin calls the Indian model an example of cooperative federalism, or is the biggest example is Niti Aayog. So according to Alfred Stephan, the Indian model is demo enabling। कौन बोल रहे हैं, ये बोले अल्फ्रेड स्टेफन बोल रहे हैं। एंड W.H. Morris Jones held the view that Indian federalism was a kind of cooperative federalism where bargaining took place between the center and the states, but ultimately a solution came out and both agreed to cooperate. So according to Casey Weir, in practice the constitution of India is a quasi-federal in nature and not strictly federal. It is union tailored according to the specific needs of the country. Thus, a strong union seems essential for coordinating vital matters of common concern and ensuring peace. Moreover, though there are some centralizing tendencies, there also exist some highly federal features like dual polity and bicameral structure of parliament. Coming to question number B, the main goal of fundamental duties in Indian Constitution is generative civic responsibility among the citizen, explain। ठीक है, तो सबसे जो मेन गोल है फंडामेंटल ड्यूटीज का, उसका काम क्या है कि एक तरह जनरेट करे सिविक रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी। सिविक मतलब क्या होता है कि आपका जो मीम चला जीरो सिविक्स है ना, तो सिविक रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी को बढ़ाने के लिए बना है अमंग द सिटीजंस, एक्सप्लेन। हम लोग आते हैं, द आइडिया ऑफ ड्यूटी कैन बी सीन इन द थॉट्स ऑफ एंशिएंट थिंकर्स सच एज एरिस्टोटल, theory of citizenship, as well as modern ones such as Hannah Arendt, theory of active citizen. However, the concept of fundamental duties were not included in the Indian Constitution until 1976 and through the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act, but once included, it rapidly displayed civic responsibility of the citizen. So, following are the civic responsibility that FD promotes। सबसे पहले ये 11 जो लिख दिया गया है, तो इसे हम लोग बाई हार्ट याद कर लेंगे। टू अबाइड बाय द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन, रिस्पेक्ट द आइडल्स एंड इंस्टीट्यूशन, नेशनल फ्लैग, नेशनल एंथम, cherish and follow the noble ideals which inspired our national struggle for freedom, to uphold and protect the sovereignty, unity, and integrity of India, to defend the country and render national services when called upon to do so, to promote harmony and the spirit of common brotherhood amongst all the people of India, to value and preserve the rich heritage of our composite culture, to promote and protect and improve the natural environment, to develop scientific temper, to safeguard public property and to observe violence, to strive towards excellence in all spheres of individual and collective activity. However, the fundamental duties have been criticized because they are not enforceable, hence ineffective. Critics also argue that there was no need of fundamental duties because laws were already existing with respect to many duties mentioned here. But the fact remains that citizens need to blueprint to become a good citizen. The idea has also been advocated by Aristotle and Hannah in their respective theories that citizens should perform in their duties of for the ideal state polity to exist and sustain. Hence, if we accept DPSP as a part for the state, fundamental duties should also be accepted as it provides a guide for good citizen by generating civic responsibility among them. क्वेश्चन नंबर सी, डॉक्टर बी आर अम्बेडकर क्लैरियन, क्या होता है, कॉल होता है, क्लैरियन मतलब क्लैरियन इज अ कॉल, क्लैरियन कॉल एजुकेट एजिटेट एंड ऑर्गेनाइज, क्या है, एजुकेट एजिटेट एंड ऑर्गेनाइज स्ट्रेटाइजेस द दलित मूवमेंट टुवर्ड्स अचीविंग सिविल लिबर्टीज डिस्कसेस. तो देखते हैं, जैसे बी आर अम्बेडकर हो गया स्टैंड्स एज अ मोनुमेंटल फिगर इन इंडियन हिस्ट्री बोथ एज अ कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल स्कॉलर एंड a pioneering social reformer. His mantra, educate, agitate, and organize, just like Arise Awake and Act, ऐसा स्वामी विवेकानंद का था, serves as a guiding philosophy for Dalit movement in emphasizing a strategic path towards the attainment of civil liberties and social justice. For Ambedkar, education transcended mere literacy. So, education transcended mere literacy. He viewed it as a potent tool for social mobility and empowerment. The scholar Gopal Guru analyzes and from the Ambedkar saw education as the foundation for self-respect. Is the foundation for self-respect and the first step towards breaking the cycles of social justice injustice. So Ambedkar emphasized the role of peaceful agitation in confronting and overturning unjust norms and practices. As Christopher Jeffrelot works have outlined, Ambedkar stressed the need for a non-violent yet assertive stand against social discrimination and untouchability. So Ambedkar was unequivocal, okay, unequivocal about the necessity of organization as a precondition for effective collective action. His advocacy for Dalit unity and organized struggle was aimed at attaining legislative protections and constitutional guarantee, a point supported by historian Eleanor Gillot. Okay, while education has advanced among the Dalit population, scholars like Anand Tel Tumbade point out that this has not led to a comprehensive eradication of systematic discrimination. Additionally, peaceful agitation, as argued by political scientist Sukhdayo Thorot, has occasionally reinforced negative stereotypes instead of dissolving them. The challenges of factionalism within Dalit organization further complicated the effectiveness of Ambedkar's triad in current times. So, Dr. Ambedkar, triad of educate, agitate, and organize, remains an enduring framework for Dalit emancipation. Nevertheless, the philosophy limitation in the face of contemporary complexities necessitates a re-evaluation. A nuanced adaptation of this principle could more effectively address modern challenges, ensuring that individual dignity, something Ambedkar championed, remains at the forefront of the Dalit movement. Question number 8. The rise of caste politics is to be attributed to both regional aspiration and electoral manifestation. Electoral manifestations. Comment. So, in contemporary India, the intervening phenomena of the casteization of politics and the politicization of caste have become increasingly pronounced. This dual process reflects a complex interplay of regional aspiration and electoral dynamics, which has reshaped the country's political landscape. Now, the general reason for the rise of caste politics, caste as identity. Historically, caste has been dominant social identity in India, influencing social interaction and hierarchies. This identity naturally spills over in the political arena. Academics like Yugandhar Yadav and Christopher Jaffelot have extensively studied caste politics, highlighting its multifaceted nature and the intersection of caste with the political power. So, how regional aspiration lead to the rise of caste politics? Diverse regional landscape. India's vast regional diversity with distinct language, culture, and historical context has led to regional aspiration becoming a prominent force in politics. Caste as a regional factor. In many regions, caste-based communities have formed political parties or interest groups to assert their regional aspiration, leveraging caste as a unifying factor. How caste manifestation leads to rise of caste politics? Voting behavior in India. The adage क्या है? The people don't cast their vote but vote their caste. This is the adage. Underscores the significance of caste in determining electoral choices. Voters often align themselves with the candidates who share their caste background. Identity politics. Political parties strategically mobilize caste identities to garner support, sometimes leading to the exclusion of other pressing issues in electoral campaigns. Empowerment of grassroots. Caste-based politics has in some cases empowered marginalized and underrepresented groups. It has provided a platform for historically disadvantaged communities to assert their rights and demand social justice. Rise of caste politics in India represent a double-edged sword. क्या है? Double-edged sword. While it reflects the democratic expression of regional aspiration and provides a means for marginalized groups to assert their right, it also risks perpetuating division and neglecting broader development issues. To navigate this complex landscape, it is crucial to align caste-based politics with constitutional provision that promote social equality, harmony, and inclusive development. Achieving a delicate balance between regional aspiration and broader national interest is the key to harnessing the potential of caste politics for the betterment of Indian society. Now, the decade of 1989 to 1999 has created an epochal shift in the Indian party system at the national level. Identify the major national trend in this party system during this era. So, according to Joya Hassan, political parties in India have played a critical role in the success of India's democracy. The Indian party system is also changing in the context of changing external and internal development. India, which is known as one party dominant system, got transformed into a multi party system from 1989 to the era of coalition politics started. From 1977 itself, we see the process of fragmentation and realization. So, according to Milan Vaisnav, the rise of regional political parties is an eternal theme of Indian politics. Regional parties operate within a limited geographic area and bank on language, minority, religion, etc. Number of regional parties in India is much larger due to diversity. Institutional factors are delinking of parliamentary and state legislative elections. It has given opportunity for regional parties for mobilization of people on local issues. India's federal system, state government deal with those issues which are of day-to-day relevance. This also gives an advantage to the regional parties. The leaders associated with regional parties are greater contact with the people at the grassroots level. Linguistic reorganization of states have given rise to dominant caste forming their own regional parties. Socioeconomic factors are the Green Revolution gave rise to the intermediate caste asserting their power even in the political sphere. The growing politicization of religion, the deepening of social cleavages as a result of continuous mobilization of people on ethnic ground, the suspension of democracy and the introduction of emergencies also led to the fragmentation of Congress and the strengthening of the regional parties. The consequences of growth and regional politics, positive consequences, democracy becoming more representative. Regionalization has strengthened the federal axis of Indian political system. It has strengthened the bargaining power of the state government, greater roles for the state even in foreign policy. Negative consequences क्या है? The rise of regional party led to the coalition of politics. Coalition politics is the absence of healthy coalition culture, has given rise to party paralysis and increased role of money and muscles power. Now, politicization of post of speaker, decline of parliament, regional issues dominate over national concern. So, according to Sudha Pai, regional parties are rooted in regional ground. They should not be seen as a byproduct of regionalism, rather phenomenon in its own right. It is a result of linguistic reorganization, decline in Congress system, uneven development, etc. Now, do you agree over the years Supreme Court has become a forum of policy evaluation? Is justify your answer? बिल्कुल खुद से इवॉल्व कर रहा है अपने देखते हैं. In Indian context, Constitution of India not only establish a powerful Supreme Court with extensive jurisdiction, but also ensures the creation of an independent judiciary. According to Madhav Khosala, Koshla and Anant Padmanabhan, the Supreme Court of India has a dual duty. It serves as both a legal authority with the appellate and constitutional power and a public institution that must navigate political pressure, societal expectation, and public aspiration. देख रहे PPP expectation. Expectation, aspiration, public pressure, societal expectation, public aspiration, political pressure. In line with the original vision of the constitutional frames, Justice V.R.V. Krishna Iyer and the P.N. Bhagwati introduced public interest litigation. ठीक है, तो PN Bhagwati ने किया and expanded its reach from privileged classes to the masses. Over time, marginalized sections of the society have approached the judiciary to assert their rights. So, over the years, the Supreme Court of India has become a significant forum for policy formulation through landmark judgment. The Indian Supreme Court role in shaping and influencing public policy can be justified by several major judgments that have had a profound impact on the country's social and economic and political landscape. Right to privacy, Puttaswamy versus Union of India 2017. In this landmark case, the Supreme Court recognized the right to privacy as a fundamental right under the Indian Constitution. Though this judgment reaffirmed individual liberties and had a far-reaching implications for data protection and surveillance policies, leading to the development of comprehensive data protection laws and privacy regulation in India. Environmental protection, secularism and religious freedom, LGBT rights, reservation policies, economic reform, BCCI cricketer, Association of Bihar 2016 ये हो गया. In this case is the other. The Indian Supreme Court has played a pivotal role in policy evolution, interpreting the constitution and providing guidance to government and lawmakers, effectively shaping public policies in diverse areas. These landmark decisions have often reflected changing societal norms and values, contributing to policy formulation and reforms in India. However, this policy formulation role of judicial activism Supreme Court has faced criticism in the Indian political landscape. Pratap Bhanu Mehta suggests that while the judiciary may aim to address democracy weakness, it can result in legal uncertainty, potential violation of legal integrity, and expansion of country's court's power. He criticizes various recent incidents, including judgment perceived as upholding the high moral principles but questionable in terms of the law, instances of judicial overreach, and the court's involvement in the political matters. So, on the other hand, the supporters of judicial activism argue that civil society embraces the concept of judicial governance as it aligns with the social expectation for accountability. They highlight milestones such as the relaxation of the rules of locus standi, the recognition of various human rights under the rights of life, provision of the constitution, and development of public interest litigation to meet a civil society expectation regarding judicial functioning. Former President Pranab Mukherjee emphasized that judicial activism would not undermine the separation of power inherent in the constitutional framework. He stresses the need for each branch of democracy to operate within its designated sphere and maintain a balance in the exercise of the authority. While the legislature and executive are subject to judicial review in the exercise of power, the judiciary checks should be self-imposed discipline and restraint. Now coming to paper 2, question number 1. What are the uh, crucial function of empirical political theory in comparative politics? So, empirical political theory in comparative politics refer to the use of empirical method to observe, measure, and analyze political phenomena across different political systems. It serves as a linchpin in understanding the mechanics, similarities, and the distinction among the various varying governance models. Methodological rigor empirical political theory offers a structured and scientific approach to comparative politics. It provides a methodology that includes observation, hypothesis testing, and statistical analysis, moving the field closer to rigorous scientific inquiry. So, as a political scientist, Adam Przeworski argues that empirical theory is methodologically conscientious and theoretically cogent. It is not mere journalism. Identifying patterns and trends utilizing empirical methods allows scholars to discern patterns, trends, and expectations across different political systems. This can include electoral system, public policy, or governance metrics. This methodology brings out both the commonalities and specificities across systems. Giovanni Sartori works in classification of party system and democratic models exemplifies how empirical analysis enriches comparative politics. Policy recommendation: the empirical approach in comparative politics offers a concrete base for suggesting policy reforms. By objectively analyzing data, it becomes possible to identify best practices and areas for improvement. In the words of Robert Dahl, empirical theory enables us to make informed judgment. In summary, empirical political theory plays an instrumental role in comparative politics by introducing methodological rigor, identifying global patterns and trends, and laying the factual foundation for policy recommendation. Its contribution is such that comparative politics would be significantly less structured and precise without it. Hence, it remains an indispensable tool in the toolkit of modern political science. Now, what are the difficulties faced by political theorists in comparing the states? तो क्या क्या difficulties आती है? This is a part of comparative politics. क्या क्या face किया जा सकता है? So, comparing states is an indispensable but intricate undertaking in the political theory, serving to better comprehend governance and structures and political system by offering a vital insights into commonalities and disparities among the governance models. The endeavor, however, represents methodological, contextual, and ethical conundrums. Methodological challenge: the absence of unified methodological framework remains a significant hurdle. For example, one might encounter incongruent findings when using federal house's qualitative criteria for political liberties versus the World Press Freedom Index quantity metrics. Arend Lees Fart noted that the perils of methodological pluralism leading to incongruent findings. Contextual barriers: states have unique historical, cultural, and socio-economic backdrops that make like for like comparison challenging. The UK's parliamentary system, steeped in historical precedent, is vastly different from the US presidential system born out of anti-colonial revolution. David Easton rightly observed that the political system can be ripped out of their social metrics. Now, ethical concerns पे आते हैं तो comparative studies often risk perpetuating stereotypes or bias, especially when reducing complex states to singular categories such as developed or underdeveloped. Cynthia Inloy has stressed the need to acknowledge the ethical dimension in comparative politics to avoid such pitfalls. Scholars and political theorists must heed Robert Dahl word that the real test of theory is applicability to solving real world problems. Therefore, it is essential to standardize methodologies, be aware of the contextual variables, and ensure ethical rigor to improve the effectiveness and relevance of comparative political theory. So, how does the democratic political construct citizenship? So, citizenship is often viewed as a legal identification, but its essence is profoundly shaped by the context of democratic politics within a nation. Democracy imprints its own unique attributes on the citizen, molding both their rights and civic engagement. Legal framework and rights. Democratic governance establishes the legal boundaries of citizenship by providing rights and duties. Drawing on the idea of social contract as proposed by John Locke, it gives citizens entitlements like freedom of speech, assembly, and voting, while also setting obligations like taxes and juridity. So participation agency, politics elevates citizens from passive subjects to active participants in governance. As Carol Patman states, the participation develops a foster very qualities necessary for it. The more individuals participate, the better able they become to do so. The process, like election and referendum, individuals become agents of their own destiny, reinforcing an active construct of citizenships, complexities, and tensions. While democracy enriches the citizenship, it also introduces tensions. The inequality of social and economic resources can after affect political participation, leading to unequal citizenship, as argued by political theorist Robert Dahl. Moreover, there can be a conflict expectation between individual rights and collective responsibility, creating dilemmas in democratic citizenship. Therefore, democratic politics both enriches and complicates the construct of citizenship. It legalizes right, encourages participation, and yet introduces complexities that can serve as the stumbling block. The project of democratic citizenship remains ever evolving, demanding continual refinement, echoing the sentiments of Alex de Tocqueville, and that the health of this democratic society may be measured by the quality of functions performed by the private citizens. Now, what is the structure and function of International Court of Justice (ICJ? ठीक है, यहाँ से क्वेश्चन आ चुका है. So ICJ was established in 1945 by UN Charter and started working in April 1946. It is the principal judicial organ of UN, situated at the Peace Palace in The Hague, Netherlands. So structure: judges 50 judges elected for 9 years with absolute majority. ठीक है, तो यहाँ कितना है? 15 judges, 9 years. Absolute majority. The 15 judges from court are distributed following regions. They 3 from Africa, 3 from Latin America and the Caribbean. ठीक है, तो ये पार्ट हो गया आपका, ये पार्ट हो गया, ये पार्ट हो गया. 3 from Asia, okay, this from 5 from Western Europe and other states, 2 from Eastern Europe. Now voted by UNG and US simultaneously but separately. One third of the court is elected every 3 years, and judges are eligible for re-elections. They are eligible for re-elections. Now jurisdiction function पे आते हैं तो ICJ acts as a world court with two-fold jurisdiction. Contentious cases, legal dispute between states submitted to it by them, and advisory proceeding, request for advisory opinion on the legal question referred to it by UN organ and or specialized agency. State communicate with the registrar of ICJ through their Minister of Foreign Affairs or the ambassador to the Netherlands. States are represented in ICJ by an agent who is the head of a special diplomatic mission of his or her country. So the judgment is final and binding on the parties to a case and without appeal. If a party is refrained from following the judgment, UNS is empowered to look into the matters and ensure compliance. Opinions provided by the court is advisory proceeding are essentially advisory and not binding. Limitation: no jurisdiction to try individual accused of war crimes or crimes against humanity. Now, ICJ can't act so moto. It can only hear a dispute when requested to do so or by one or more states. No compulsory jurisdiction. It can only have a jurisdiction based on consent. Absence of full separation of power. P5 members of the UNSC are able to veto enforcement of cases. The ICJ is endowed with both the privileged institutional status and the procedural instrument whose potential is frequently underestimated. It needs strengthening for the promotion and development of international peace. One such initiative can be extension of the jurisdiction to the realm of crime against humanity. It can be used to mandate the state parties to frame national laws on subject. If succeeded, the credibility of the ICJ can be strengthened. Discuss the structure and function of the UN Security Council. Established in 1945, the UN Security Council is one of the five principal organs of the United Nations. It is charged with the maintenance of international peace and security, as well as accepting new members to the United Nations and approving any changes to the UN Charter. Its powers include the establishment of peacekeeping operation, the imposition of international sanctions, and the authorization of military action through Security and Council resolution. UNSC members, they are permanent and non-permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. A total of 15 members are there in council, out of 5 are permanent and 10 non-permanent. Non-permanent members elected for 2 years by the National UNGA. 5 non-permanent members of UNSC are replaced every 2 years. Members are elected from all 3 regions of the world: Africa, Asia, Latin America, Caribbean, Western Europe, and Eastern Europe. I don't see the name of the America. So the function of UNSC, the maintaining international peace. UN charter authorities the Security Council to investigate an institution threatening international peace, recommend procedure for peaceful resolution of a dispute. So the imbalance in the power relationship among P5 and the rest of the world needs to be corrected urgently. And also it is needed to reform the Security Council through an expansion in permanent and non-permanent seats to enable the UN organ to better deal with the ever complex and evolving challenges to maintenance of international peace and security. Now discuss the relevance of normative ethos of non-alignment movement in magnifying India's soft power in the pursuit of her national interest. तो क्या है relevance? Founded as an alternative to Cold War bipolarity, non-alignment movement offered state a third way in international politics. India, a founding member, has integrated NAM normative principle like peace and sovereignty into its foreign policy. International integration has been fulcrum in augmenting India's soft power, thereby serving the national interest effectively. The non-alignment movement is headed through the Bandung Conference enshrined principles such as peace and non-aggression and sovereignty for India. These principles have been template for ethical, independent foreign policy that has elevated its standing among developing nations. Um, Building on Joseph Nye concept of superpower, India's alignment with NAM principle has endured it with significant capabilities in diplomacy and cultural outreach, from cultural initiatives like yoga diplomacy to educational ventures like ITC. India has been able to project itself as a more than just a economic or military entity. India's soft power is not an end, but as a means to broader objective. For instance, NAM ethos has helped India forge a strategic partnership, like its balanced relation between US and Russia or its collaboration with the BRICS, even in the critical sectors. Like energy, India's ethical stance has opened doors to relationship with both Iran and Saudi Arabia. Finally, it is worth noting that NAM principles often align with the global objectives such as Sustainable Development Goals. This alignment amplifies India's credibility and influence in international fora, as seen in its leadership role in the International Solar Alliance. However, it is essential to be conscious of the limitation. Robert Kaplan portrayed geopolitics as an endless drama, and India's reliance on NAM normative ethos increasingly seen as outdated. The world has transitioned from bipolarity to multipolarity, and new alliances like Quad are taking shape. Furthermore, NAM credibility is often questioned due to its silence on issues like human rights violation, affecting the perceived legitimacy of India's soft power. While NAM has historically been significant as a safe sphere of India's soft power, it is crucial to appraise its continuing relevance critically in a rapidly changing landscape. India must evaluate whether NAM principle can sustain their utility in the projection of soft power and pursuit of national interest. Therefore, then scholars like Samuel P. Huntington have observed evolving geopolitical scenario necessitates a revision, perhaps an evolution and increased normative frameworks.